I feel like all my kids grew up and then they married each other. It's every parent's dream.
These videos are not for children. If you're a children, then piss off.
Hey there, it's me, your least favorite YouTuber, the Infuso. And since I've already spoke about the day The Office died, today I thought I could take a look back at its funeral. The big finale, the grand send-off to one of the most beloved American sitcoms that was originally actually a British mockumentary. And while the show was firing on all cylinders when it was in its prime, at its end, it was shooting comedic blanks. I've gone in depth about the final season of the show, and I actually probably will again when I cover the show season to season. But I want to make it clear that this last episode isn't the product of a floundering season. It feels very much removed from the rest of the season that it's in. It almost feels like the episode that came before it was the season finale, while this two-parter serves as the series finale. This episode takes place after the documentary's been finished and serves as a reunion of sorts for the Dunder Mifflin crew, which, premise-wise, I enjoy. It sort of seems like the perfect ending for a show that is in fact presenting itself as an actual documentary, but in execution, it's far from perfect. So I'm going to start off by saying something a little bit controversial to some fans here. I think a big part of the problem with this episode is that it's centered around Dwight.
It's true.
Yep, I know. Just hear me out, though. I'm not just going to leave it there. I got more to say. It was always really odd for me how the show started to romanticize Dwight toward the end of its run. There were always moments along the way that showcased his humanity in spite of, well, himself. But he was never the hero. Never the main character that you wanted to root for. Yet, by time this series finale comes around, he's really all that's left. Jim, the show's main protagonist, had already found his happily ever after, marrying the love of his life and having children with her. Michael Scott, the series lead, had already bowed out and taken his exit 2 seasons before. His seeming replacement Andy Bernard didn't work out the way showrunners had hoped, and with Ed Helms leaving mid-season to film the third Hangover movie, it left the show with no one else to turn to but Dwight. Dwight was one of The Office's greatest characters, a highlight even during the low points of the show. But he just wasn't this guy.
You're not that guy, pal. Trust me. You're not that guy.
This was like watching someone try to fit a square peg in a star hole. And no, that wasn't a euphemism. At the beginning of the episode, we're shown Dwight firing Kevin, and then later the two reunite right before his wedding, with Jim noting how much Dwight missed Kevin, and how firing him weighed on his conscience. But I don't know, that just doesn't really seem like the character that's been established. After all these years, it still feels like Dwight is only just beginning to get comfortable with Jim and Pam. And now you want me to believe that he's best friends with everyone in the office? Excuse me? Furthermore, did Dwight and Kevin really have a friendship to speak of? Where is the evidence of this? I've watched the show for years, and it seems like these two have barely spoke outside of Dwight occasionally throwing an unintentional, or actually sometimes directed, jab in his direction. I don't know, this sentimental moment feels incredibly forced, and a little bit out of left field. I don't know if the two of them are the right characters to have this moment with. I don't think Dwight ever really cared about Kevin. And I don't think Kevin had one feeling or another in particular toward Dwight. While Dwight's turn to the light side always felt off to me, I personally don't feel that it worked and I will stand by it. I think to some degree it can almost be overlooked. Despite Dwight not really working in this role, you could still take comfort in seeing one of the show's strange stars celebrated as it comes to a close. More Dwight isn't a bad thing. But what really can't be ignored is the light this put the Dwight and Angela relationship in. You see, Dwight and Angela had almost always been romantically linked. Since season 2, they were as thick as thieves, and had the same amount of honor amongst them as well. Dwight and Angela had a completely tumultuous relationship, one that involved constant manipulation, cheating on other people with each other, love contracts, and the most uncomfortable scenes I have ever seen outside of Scott's Tots. They were often awful to each other, and their relationship saw much more bad than it did good. It was mostly played for comedic effect. Their antics were a means to laughter, except on certain instances where it was used to further humanize Dwight. But the same couldn't be said for Angela. As a matter of fact, they seem to try to make a distinction between the two by showing that Dwight was somebody who could be redeemed, but Angela could not. But then later episodes of the show kind of contradict that. They were never supposed to be the couple that fans rooted for. They were a fun, bizarre pairing that worked for laughs when needed. But they weren't this be-all, end-all, end goal. The last episode is building to the show's third most important ship, who are the show's toxic couple comedic relief, getting married. Which is a good thing now, apparently. Even though before, for years, it was shown not to be, now it is. Now this is something to be celebrated. In this final episode, Angela is shown to be sweet and supportive. She's beyond loving, and I would even say nurturing to a degree. Overall, she's just a pleasant person. And all of that feels incredibly out of character for the character that's been established. The last episode of the show really tries to soften Angela's edges to make her more digestible for an audience. But you had 9 years to do that, and you chose to do it now in the last 51 minutes of the entire show's runtime? It felt more than a little bit forced. I do feel like this was something the later half of the season was building up to. You know, this sudden evolution in character. But they were building to it. The finale went all in with it. I just don't feel like it works. Too much has been done, and we have so very little time to compensate for all of that. I think this whole development takes away from the character's actual purpose. Angela was never developed to be a likable person, or someone that you could learn to love in spite of themselves. Angela was presented as having next to no redeeming qualities, and being generally awful to just about everyone around her. You're not supposed to sympathize or relate to her. At times, she's the blatant antagonist, much like Dwight. Unlike Dwight, though, the show did incredibly little to humanize her and make her a fully fleshed out human being. She was just constantly insufferable, and that was her trait. It also sucked to see Andy devolve so much as a character. I thought the series went out of their way to redeem him and make you root for him, only to factory reset him back to season 3. He's a joke that you're not sure if you should laugh with or cringe at. The show softens the blow a little bit by showing that he ended up semi-successful and somewhat happy, so I won't get too much into that, because Andy honestly is a completely different subject for a completely different video. So I'm not going to complain too much about that. I think they did the bare minimum here to make him okay. I think what's most interesting about this sitcom send-off, though, is that it doesn't have a whole lot of laughs. The episode isn't all that funny. The jokes are far and few between. And the jokes there aren't actually all that funny. I mean, they're not awful, but they're just chuckle-worthy at best. There are still some memorable moments and conclusions. Erin finally meeting her biological mother is a sweet, touching moment. I like that they got Joan Cusack just for that one scene. Money well spent. I think the way things ended for Kelly and Ryan is incredibly stupid, and therefore perfect for those two characters. Like Dwight and Angela, their rough relationship is a fixture of the show that's played for laughs. And this is the perfect way to cap off this coupling. It's nice to see that the cycle of chaos continues for this dysfunctional duo. Creed's story ended the only way that I think that it could have. And the return of Michael Scott, while properly predictable, is incredibly sentimental. Watching him goof off and bond with Dwight nursed my nostalgia, and I wouldn't trade that for the world. However, I do still have some issues with it. First off, I feel like this is a sad misuse of Steve Carell. He hardly appears in the show's big goodbye, and he's probably the one most responsible for its success. I think I enjoyed the seasons without him a little bit more than most people did, but I still have to admit that the show was changed without him. There was a noticeable absence with him gone, and no matter who they tried to utilize, no one could quite fill that void. You would think that he'd have more of a presence in the finale, but he honestly hardly even gets a line. This episode suffers greatly from a lack of Michael Scott. I get that he moved and moved on with his life, but I think ideally he and Holly would have returned during the Q&A section. This wasn't just Jim and Pam's love story, the camera crew also captured theirs. You'd think that Michael would want to spend some time with the people he once thought of as family. Michael's exit from the show made sense given the story that was provided. But given this story, an earlier arrival would have made sense. Instead, he just had very little to do. It's just weird to think about. He's not even in the final scene at the office with the cast saying their goodbyes. So for as glad as I am to see him make any kind of return, I can't help but feel like ultimately he was tragically underutilized. Even with the last episode desperately trying to wrap things up for everybody, it does feel like one or two characters are left with little to do. They're just sort of there for attendance purposes. The happy endings felt like they trampled over themselves at times. It's a little overwhelming when you're watching the end to 7 or 8 plot points all at once when they have no correlation to each other whatsoever. Even Jim, who is, by all intents and purposes, the series' lead, feels like a bit player in the finale. It feels like he gets less screen time than usual. Of course, he's secretly putting things together as Dwight's best man, but he's just not all that present. I have a lot of problems with this series finale, but I want to make clear, it's not awful. This isn't horrendously bad. Actually, in some ways, I think it might have been better if it was. But this ending is just so bland and bleh. Suffice it to say, it very much feels like an over-idealized ending for most of the characters. And it feels a little strange for this series. Everyone's so nice and just genuinely happy to be around each other, which has not been the case for the last near decade. I know that this episode takes place further down the line, but it's not that far down the line. It's a year later. It's a year after the last episode. Now, for whatever it's worth, no. I don't think this was a fitting finale for The Office. I don't think it's terrible, but I definitely find it lacking. The humorless nature of this episode is striking, but I will say it's compensated for by the sweet tone of the story. The humorless nature of this episode is striking, but I will say it's compensated for by the sweet tone of the story. This is a tender-hearted goodbye. A celebration of nostalgia before parting ways with it seemingly forever. While the episode doesn't hit my funny bone, I will give it credit for tugging at my heartstrings. There's something sweet about watching the cast sit at their characters' cubicles, seeing them in a more relaxed environment despite it being the same environment the show normally took place in. And actually, come to think of it, very little of this episode took place in. I mean, the show is called The Office. You at least have your episode be about The Office. Not that that's a real complaint, I'm just stating. While I've criticized this two-parter a lot, I do think it's a fitting tribute to the series itself. Story-wise, I think there's some plot points and story beats that don't necessarily feel organic. It's filled with unrealistic evolutions of characters, a never-ending well of happy endings, and in my opinion, put focus on and prioritize the wrong characters. With that being said, I don't really know what else they could have done. There's a bunch of characters who need some sort of satisfying note to wrap their arcs up on. The show's main couple's already been married, technically twice, and now have children. The leading man, Prince Charmless, found his princess in a different castle and left the show. So really, where were they gonna go from here? Their hands were kind of tied on this one. I would say that the Office series finale it's passable. It's passable. I would say passable. That's the right word. It's not awful in its own right, but it's not awesome in its own right either. I mean, I wouldn't say it was bad, but I wouldn't say that it was good. It was underwhelming and disappointing given the series that it's attached to. But despite all of that, man oh man, does that one scene with them at the tables really get me in my feels. Anyway, if you like this video and would like to see an Office retrospective broken down season by season here on the channel, let me know in the comment section below by leaving me a comment saying,
That's what she said.
I was your least favorite YouTuber, Infuso, and I thank you for watching. Hope to see you in the next one.
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bad time. Same bad channel.